Hello and welcome to this episode of Fantasy Reality. And in this episode, let's talk about something that doesn't normally come up in a fantasy series. And that is technology. In a lot of your fantasies, we tend to set them in a medieval-like world. You know, where magic exists, apparently. You know, you have your wizards, you have dragons, we might have knights of some sort. A good example of this is another great fantasy series, by the way, is Gordon R. Dickson's Dragon Knight series. Basically, this is set in an alternative medieval world, England specifically, during about the 1300s, about the time when Prince Edward the Black was around. So, roughly 1300s. Now, in the first book, the George and the Dragon, the Dragon and the George, to be honest, Gordon R. Dickson, he hadn't done much research of medieval England at the time. He hadn't done, so in that book, nothing matches up. For the most part, nothing really matches up with England. Because they're talking about a swamp down in one section, and I'll be honest, I don't know much of England. For all I know, there is a swamp, which would make Mr. Dickson accidentally correct and having a swamp in that area. But, and he was correct on a few facts, such as having Brian, he's a knight native to the area, who, one scene, he's taken a bath in a creek. And he's got his clothes set out, so that way, and James, he's our guy from our world, or rather, somewhere around late 20th century, just before the 21st, and he's stuck into the body of a dragon, which is why he's later called the Dragon Knight. He takes a look at the clothes and realizes that they're dry. It's like, because you're thinking, you must have washed them, but then it's like, why are they dry? And Brian's like, explains that lice and fleas like to infest clothes. So, and that they are rather annoying. And to be fair, you wouldn't want to be itching yourself all the dang time, now would you? Say, where you hate the flea? As the fleas do become a bit of a plot device later on in this particular book, where the Dragon and the Fair Maid of Kent, when the bubonic plague is being spread around and people are worried about it, especially James, because he knows exactly what it does. And basically, he has his clothes. The guy has his. In this scene, the guy has his clothes set out to essentially bake in the sun to drive out any infestive pests, which is smart. And specifically, the one piece of clothing is a gambeson, which is what a lot of knights and other people who wore armor actually wore on top of whatever other clothes they were wearing, and then they put on their armor. Because if you're just putting on armor, it's gonna pinch and chafe and a bunch of other things. So, and let's talk about armor. In the medieval world, having full-plated armor, depending on the era, that would be like the equivalent of us having a really expensive Italian suit. You know, the kind that's worth $2,000 plus, you know. And of course, you could get those really fancy ones that cost you $10,000. There's more than I can hear. I haven't spent that on a suit of clothes. And let's talk about the horses. The horse talked a lot about. Well, there's actually two of them, and specifically in this case is a horse called Blanchard. And according to Brian apparently spent his full inheritance just to get that horse. And he'd rather lose anything else. He'd rather give up anything else than to lose that horse. And given the way this horse acts, it's like, yeah, I can see from an emotional standpoint you'd want to keep that horse around. But then you got to realize horses are expensive, and a good horse is even more expensive, especially one that's well trained. Apparently, this horse is so obedient and protective that that there's a scene where there's a battle. Brian, he's been knocked out. James, due to the circumstances, was on the opposing side as the guy that had unhorsed him. But there's a little bit other. Well, anyways, like I said, there's Brian laying on the ground. Here's James. Well, up comes Blanchard. He thinks James at that moment in time is the enemy and goes to attack. It's like, whoa, boy! And that horse and James, he manages to cast a ward because he's got magic. And anyways, well, that horse still around, and eventually it starts to rain. Now there is another horse, James's, and the name of that horse is Gorp. He named it after his Ford car, which he always called a Gorp because it was always a mess. And Gorp, he apparently was a draft horse that basically got pressed into duty for being a war horse, which does occasionally happen. And Gorp, he's not as well trained as Blanchard. And eventually it starts to rain, and, well, Gorp, he looks at the rain and is like, forget this, walks off under a tree. Blanchard, he sees his master still on the ground. He stands there. Rain coming down. The only thing he's concerned about is his master. That tells you how well trained that horse is and how that horse is worth everything that Brian spent just to keep it. Just to get it. And that how far he'd be willing to go just to keep that horse safe. And now, again, still using that series, specifically, there's a scene in The Dragon and in Lyonesse, and Lyonesse, it's basically where the Arthurian knights went to after the fall of Camelot, and apparently, and it's a land under the sea. And there's a scene where James, he and his group are in that area because they're trying to warn them about an attack from the Dark Powers, who are basically, they're going to ruin everything, basically. Apparently that's their goal. Ruin everything. And James is separated from most of his companions for one reason or another. and he encounters a knight, or a man in armor at any rate. And what you need to know is the Arthurian knights. A lot of those are from stories that came about during the late Roman Empire area as it starts to fall in trouble. So, and James, like I said, 13th century. So, this man, he's in armor, and his armor, like I said, late Roman era. So, the way you look at it is, James, he's in decent armor for his era. The other guy, he was in decent armor for that era. But what you gotta think about is that there's at least 500 to 800 years worth of technology difference. And apparently the other knight, the other man, he's under some sort of curse that says, I cannot let you pass unless you defeat me. And if you are beaten, you must commit a foul deed in order to save your life. And, well, James is quite literally forced into charging him on his horse. And one thing, like I said, there's the armor advantage that James has. Although James, he's not comfortable with charging people for various reasons. At least which is, he grew up in our sort of era. And fighting is just not second nature to him. Unlike a typical medieval person. Of course, one thing to think about is the fact that the horses. That Gorp is a draft horse. He's big, he's heavy. The other horse is a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter. And so, when James is forced to do, okay, I gotta do this, well, due to his armor and the weight of the horse and all the other stuff, technology, he manages to unseat the other guy, causing him to fall down. And also, James then takes advantage of the fact that he's still on his horse, takes out his sword and whacks the guy upside the head, hitting the guy's armor, in the guy's helmet. Now what you need to realize, like I said, there's at least 500 to 800 years worth of difference in the armor. James, he's wearing essentially a helm. This guy, he's wearing something that the Normans and the Vikings might have worn. You know, he's got this protecting him, maybe the nose guard. Up, just hit him on the side of the head, knocked him out long enough for him to get off his own horse. It's like, yield! Please, yield! Yeah, basically use that to his advantage. So, now let's get back to technology. In a lot of your fantasies, like I said, we like to set it in a medieval type of world. Lord of the Rings, there's a good one. I mean, I haven't sat down and read it, to be honest with you. I haven't seen the movies. It looks pretty good. I'm not exactly medieval. I'm not the kind of guy. I mean, I might end up someday taking a look at the Lord of the Rings movies on it in full detail and read the books a little bit better. But still, technology's pretty good. Decent medieval era. Then there's others that incorporate a bit more magic into things up. Such as the Warcraft series. Again, a lot of the times the weapons depicted in there are a bit fancier compared to typical medieval stuff, and there's nothing wrong with that. Although the real trick is you got to deal with what looks like it's standard medieval versus a fantasy medieval type of weapons. You got to explain, okay, what's the difference? It turns out that these things are made out of a different material. which is suited to be done up in a certain way, and has certain enchantments, okay, that's usually good. And you take a look at, like, how is magic used in the crafting. I could see how magic could be utilized in this technology. And in fact, there are instances where technology is improved through magic, or magic is improved through technology. And there's even like some where there's like a joint effort of mixing technology and magic. And in which case you got something known as Magitech, which turns out to be quite useful. Like I said, as stated, a lot of your fantasies are set in a medieval world. But what if we decided to increase the level of technology and bring it out of the proverbial dark ages? And let's set it in early 21st century New Orleans, such as Dragons Wild by Robert Asprin. Very good book, along with Dragon's Luck. Basically in this book we have our young hero, protagonist, a man named Griffin, who is a bit of a card artist. And, he's been to Chicago. Well, he basically went to college in Michigan. And, well, he's pretty much done with his studies. He's about ready to go to a job with his uncle. Basically drops a bit of a bombshell that, hey, by the way, you're a dragon. And so am I. And so's your sister, by the way. And it's like, yeah, right. And the days until Uncle Mel lights a cigar. That Griffin goes, okay. And eventually finds out a bit more about. It basically ends up, because of course the problem is you got people who are after him for one reason or another. So he and his sister, they have a friend who's like, hey, why don't you head down to New Orleans? And it turns out this friend is also a dragon. Or at least part dragon. And it's like, hey, listen, I work for a guy down there, and quite literally, we want to join you. Apparently this group has essentially been on the bottom of the dog pile for so long, it's like, any improvement is an improvement. Yeah. They saddle up with the big bad, hey, that's an improvement. They saddle up with the big good, that's an improvement, as far as they're concerned, because they've been at the bottom so long. Any way up would be a good option for them. So, our guy, he goes down there, and he learns about this operation, which apparently is illegal gambling, basically. And along the way, he learns what it means to be a dragon, and he learns about how the fact that, listen, we are able to use a bit of magic which protects us, which makes us look human from birth, and it's usually when we're around 18, folks tell what's going on, and apparently Griffin, he's about as near full dragon as there is, and that also includes his sister. And he's flat out told that there's other groups out there who have plans for him and his sister, and not all of them are good. And when his sister Valerie finds out about some of these so-called plans, well, there's a saying about why you don't ever want to upset a woman. And she don't like some of these other guys' plans. And it's like, okay. Rule number 1, never upset this woman. Because, oh boy. And, well, and as he learns that there's other stories that aren't quite as fictional as he once was told. He learns about werewolves, he learns about shapeshifters, he learns about pixies, he learns about fairies, he learns about witches, wizards, magic users, and all these other supposedly fictional beings. Sadly, Robert Asprin, he died after writing Dragon's Luck, so I don't know what could have gone. That being said, he was a prolific writer, and I'd have to check out some of his other stuff. But there is another writer who did deal with what's known as urban fantasy. That is Terry Pratchett. And his Discworld series, 42 novels, plus various adult, some of which are young, which run the full gamut of all sorts. You got young adult stuff, you got a couple of kids stuff, you got a lot of other things. And it's like, it deals with, and the world is set in, at first a couple of books seem, okay, typical fantasy. But as you read, it's actually more of a, it's more like it's set around 1850s, to be honest. 1850s England, roughly. Certain parallels, at any rate. And, you know, where the technology is about. I mean, there's some things that aren't in, but it's a great day. But you read them, it's like, okay, you can see certain parallels. And it's like, okay, and it kind of explains how a society with magic would function. It's pretty good. I enjoy it. And there's other stories out there that deal with urban fantasy. And one would be the relatively recent movie, Bright, where you have the typical Tolkien races. You know, you have, at the very least, you got elves, you got humans, and you got orcs, at any rate. And there's centaurs, there's a couple of them. There's apparently lizard folk, and there's apparently dwarves, those are mentioned. And apparently there's a couple other races, I'd have to double check. But, but basically, it seems to be essentially Los Angeles, really, and it is Los Angeles, you know, and he uses the different races as a metaphor for racism, prejudice, that sort of stuff. And I do know one urban fantasy that, in my opinion, could use a bit of work, and that would be the Harry Potter series. I mean, mentally I'd have to double check on them, but it's like, you mean you wizards and witches don't know about technology too well? Come on! I mean, okay. I mean, like, when the students are writing, they're not using pens or pencils like we would use. No, they're using quills. You know, they're using quill feathers. What's the difference? This contains a ready reservoir of ink. It's made out of plastic. Got a metal tip. Very much the same. And it's an easier form for writing. Same with a pencil. I mean, it's like, really? I mean, yeah. Maybe what's a fountain pen gonna do? Yeah, give a reason as to why they didn't use them. You know, I mean, the guy walks in with a fountain pen and Oh, great, that was my favorite pen, too. And that was also my favorite shirt. My mother got me this shirt. You know, something like that. Then it's like, you know, at least lampshade that there's certain improvements don't work in this area. You know, that'd be a good analogy. And, I mean, they mentioned that certain technologies don't work around certain magics. Okay, I can get with that. But the fact that the majority of the wizards and witches, I mean, it's like, really? They don't even know what a firearm is. They had to call it a magic stick that muggles like to use. A magic stick that muggles like to use? No offense, but firearms been around since the 1300s. And granted, back in the 1300s, said firearms aren't really all that good. But, but if you watch the technology, eventually you get to the rifled muzzleloaders, and eventually you get to some guy who figures out how to put in more than one bullet. You know, like the revolvers, and then the various rifles and shotguns and handguns that have been used since the 1850s. And these guys don't pay attention to that. I mean, granted, the Harry Potter series is set largely in England, but I think even English folk know what a firearm is, despite the fact that they got laws that say who can and who can't own one. But I think they would know what a firearm is. Ugh. Say nothing about. I mean, now with the Harry Dresden series, the guy actually owns a firearm, a revolver, and it also explains why he doesn't have a double eagle pistol. You know, apparently that's true apparently magic and that kind of technology, either the gun would misfire or just wouldn't work. And apparently he's got to use an old car because of that. And because apparently, basically, the way magic is apparently described in the Harry Dresden universe is essentially like taking a magnet and waving it in front of a laptop. It tends to mess things up. Which is why it's a bad idea to wave a magnet in front of a laptop. Which means this guy, he literally can't just walk into a hospital. That being said, there are, of course, areas, as I've stated, where magic and technology go hand in hand, and what you have is what's known as Magitech. And another type of fantasy, which has a lot of technology, is science fantasy. And for a long time, one could say it could be, and for me, best way to separate magic and fantasy, fantasy and science fiction, was a very simple thing. Science fiction has laser guns, fantasy has magic wands. Yeah, science fiction has laser guns, like Star Trek. Whereas fantasy has magic wands. Yeah. But what if you get, let's say when you take, let's get with an urban fantasy or science fantasy, where you actually have these, these there's relatively high level technology working hand in hand with magic. Then you have a lot of interesting things going on. And of course, you got the science fantasy. In fact, some series, such as Warhammer 40K, that was actually came about through the fantasy version of Warhammer, but with Warhammer 40k, which is apparently set in the year 40,000, we got. I mean, sometimes it's a way of saying there's a technology, but magic, either A, came back, or has always been hidden, or has been used hand in hand. So interesting when you think about it. It's like, how would that sort of society work? And then of course, let's talk about a series that is a fantasy, but has no magic, or very little, actually. And that would be Brian Jake's Red Wolf series. Love it. Own all the novels. But there's very little magic in it. And what magic there is usually some sort of trickery. Stage magic. Although there is a few exceptions, but even then it's more like a meditation. You see the spirit. It's more of a what does my future hold? It isn't, let's throw a lightning bolt. And I wouldn't call it a strictly medieval fantasy, but it's like, you take a look at these various races. You got little guys, you got big guys. You got the hard-working types. You got the guys who are kind of lazy. Mice, rats. You have moles, you have voles, you have shrews, you have ferrets, weasels, otters, hares, badgers, foxes, owls, sparrows, snakes, lizards. These sort of things. It's more like a mouse world, really. It quite literally is a mouse world. And for the most part, magic is usually, like I said, it's just more like the stage magic. A little bit of illusion. The whole smoke and mirrors. And although there is scenes where the hero is asleep or is in a bit of a trance, and they hear a voice. The voice being that of Martin the warrior, who basically is to the folks in Mossflower like George Washington is to the people of the United States of America. Basically. He's a guy that everybody looks up to and admires and would like to be like. At least so far as the heroes are concerned. And one thing you need to keep in mind is this was written for children, and for the most part, these guys are clear black and white where their alignment is. They're a hero or a villain, usually based on their species. Because mice, always good. Rats, always evil, for instance. But again, even so, there's been a couple of rat mice that not so good. In fact, there's actually a tribe of thieves who, well, more chaotic good than anything. Then you have a few rats who, for one reason or another, they decided, I don't want to be a corsair anymore. And I didn't rather be a carpenter. And You actually get that one in The Bell Ringer. Well, The Bell Maker, where you have this rat who... His captain is a cruel and evil one. Commits a lot of atrocities. And this rat, he's like, I don't want to do that anymore. And basically, after the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, he where the captain murdered this badger who had done no real harm to them. Well, Blackguard, this rat, he decided that was it, and basically what he did was he strangled his cat with his bare hands on the basis of, you're too evil, you're too bad, Captain, you're bad, and I know I ain't a good, but that badger lady did us no harm. Yeah, basically, it's like, I'm sorry, Captain, but I gotta do it. You know, and you could say that Blackguard essentially, he's been on the path of redemption throughout the whole book. I mean, we don't know too much about Blackguard's misdeeds, if he did any, other than he was a bosun. He basically made sure that the ship was steered correctly, apparently, and apparently failed at guard duty. This one earlier in the book, which essentially just left him and the captain. And the captain knows, like, ideas, okay, they find out about Redwall, it's like, okay, we're gonna rob this place. Are you sure about that, Captain? Yes. And of course, the misdeeds aren't too obvious. They're trying to steal the treasure. And Blackguard, he's like, I'm starting to like this place. I think I'd rather stay here. I like these people. They're being nice to me. And of course, the captain, he doesn't hear about this, and very basically certain one murder later, the two of them are on the run, and Blackguard, he realizes that he's had enough. Basically snaps, and he actually returns to the scene of the murder. And it's like, here, do whatever you want with me. Redwaller's actually sparing. Of course, one thing that the Redwallers tend to do, or as well as the folks in Mossflower, is they actually do a lot of sparing of their enemies. And the Mossflower, for instance, Zarmenia's forces, they're basically stuck in the middle of a lake, and they all get to shore. They're kind of disorganized. They all get captured. You know, the ones that are left, and it's like, alright. And it's like, what do we do with them? Well, the Red Mossflower folk, they're not gonna, they decide, okay, let's give them food and split them up and tell them to go that way, and that way. And that's pretty much what they do. They tell them, you're free to go. Just don't come back here. And this process is actually repeated in a number of other instances where, when the chances there, it's like we captured some prisoners, and it's like, you're free to leave, just don't ever come back here. Although there have been situations where surrender either wasn't on the table or at least wasn't given, but even so, there's a lot of one instance would be Lord Brocktree, where a third of the forces of the enemy forces kind of realize, okay, these guys are realize, okay, the boss is being oppressive and cruel, let's leave. You know, okay, but let's get back to technology. Well, like I said, a lot of that stuff is based on medieval technology. You know, Although they got armor. Well, some of them. They have medieval type of weaponry. It's pretty interesting. Although one could argue about the sizes and whatnot, that certain creatures should have certain other weapons, but it's a different discussion for another time. And then, another one is where we have the Shannara series by Terry Brooks. That is actually set post-apocalyptic world where magic has come back, and there's some mentions of old tech, but for the most part, the technology has been reduced to a medieval level, and same with the rest of society. The Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini. Again, that's more of a medieval type of setting, typical fantasy. Some people will argue that it's essentially a rip-off of the Star Wars series, and to be fair, there's a lot of... I'll be fair, it is basically Star Wars in the fantasy world. Then there's, Mercedes Lackey's Dragon Riders of Pern. That could be magic. That could be a science fantasy. Although, it's more of a science fiction. Where you have people on another planet. They originally came from Earth stock. They end up on Pern. Planet that eligible resources ineligible Earth. Actually, basically the planet was Earth-like, resources ineligible. Basically they due to a common threat that hits the planet every century or so, the people are forced to create dragons, and these dragons are key to the planet's future and survival. And the Dragon Riders essentially are able to communicate telepathy. And the technology is not industrial, like ours, or futuristic. It's more of a high agrarian technology. It's more of a medieval type of setting. Sometimes, some of these people are very feudal. We have lords, we have guilds and the like. Another urban fantasy series is His Majesty's Dragon by Nome Novik. Naomi Novik. Basically, in this case, it's actually set during the Napoleonic Wars, and everybody has an air force, and this air force consists of dragons. Again, quite interesting. Way people. To be honest, where technology and magic is concerned, we come up with a lot of stuff. Like I just pulled off my shelves. I got a few here and there. Oh, another good urban fantasy series is S.I.D. Lackey's Elemental Masters. This one here being essentially a prototype called The Fire Rose. And most of the Elemental Masters are set in early 20th century Europe, although in this case, this one is set in California, 1906. Just before the Great Earthquake. And basically, it's essentially an update to a lot of fantasy stories. in this case, Beauty and the Beast. And that it's a bit of an urban fantasy series. I'll be honest, I haven't read the other ones. I can't double check. But like I said, fantasy and technology, magic and technology. Well, yes, this is getting a little long, but I'm going to tell you this. Don't be afraid to have your guys have magic and technology. You kind of need technology in one form or another. Otherwise, how do we know what type of a setting this world is? In any case, you do it right, it's going to be good. You know, do a bit of research on your magic, do a little bit of research on the technology, you know, do some extrapolation like, yeah, how would they work together? What is possible? Is it possible that the magic disrupts the technology, technological aspects? I mean, what is it about the technology that is disrupted to the? What is it about the magic that is disrupted to the technology? Like I said, with the Harry Dresden series, he's essentially basically it's like waving a magnet in front of a computer. It messes the computer up, and which is why Harry Dresden himself does not have the latest of gadgets, and has to rely on older things such as a revolver, because it's simpler for him. You know, it's only got a few working parts. It does not misfire as often for him as a semi-automatic pistol, for instance. And on the other hand, we have situations where magic and technology work hand in hand. You know. So, take your own spin where magic and technology are concerned. Alright? Thank you. That's it for this episode of Fantasy Reality.